What's up, Internet? My name is Andrew S. Klug, also known as Atomic Space Kitten, or just ASK for short. And this video is called Don't Be the Turkey, a belt and suspenders approach to personal digital asset management. Now, back in the old days, if you had a photo collection, you could stuff it in a box and put it under the stairs in the basement, and you knew where it was. Well, nowadays, that's not the world we live in anymore. Nowadays, pretty much everything has gone digital across multiple devices. I remember my first digital camera back in the early 2000s. It was pretty clunky and produced poor quality images. But since then, with the advent of the iPhone and the mobile revolution, it's well more than a decade, and probably closer to 2 decades, since much of our image creation has gone digital. Although film photography does seem to be experiencing a resurgence lately, especially with Gen Z. Now, in regards to managing a photo collection, the digital revolution presents both advantages and disadvantages. In the old days, everything was safe in that box under the stairs. Unless your house burnt down, in which case everything was gone. I'd invite you to see my other video called What to Do with All Those Boxes Full of Old Photos. Whereas now that things are digital, you can easily have multiple copies of assets, and therefore you're not as vulnerable to the single catastrophic loss. This idea of redundancy is very important, and it's something we'll come back to shortly. But for now, let me just say that it's a double-edged sword and needs to be properly managed. Digital collections do present their own issues. Because there are so many copies of things, the challenge is now how to keep track of everything, since it's not just in one box under the stairs. Your photos can be in multiple places, and as you go on through the years, it can get out of control and turn into a hot mess. I'd invite you to see my other video called What to Do with All Those Old Hard Drives Full of Photos. So the question is, how do you properly manage your photo collection in today's digital age? In today's cloud-based and ecosystem-based computing environment, there are a number of touted one-stop shop solutions for managing your photo collection. There's Google Photos, Apple Photos iCloud, Amazon Photos, and Adobe Lightroom. In regards to this last one, I'll come back to this because I actually do use Adobe Lightroom, but I use Lightroom Classic as opposed to the main Lightroom product that was formerly called Lightroom CC. And I'll circle back on the difference between these two products shortly. All of these aforementioned are great products with useful features, and the choice mostly depends on which ecosystem has you most within its gravitational field: Apple, Google, Amazon, etc. Now, by design, these products are not interoperable, but rather they are designed as one-stop shop solutions. And moreover, each of the ecosystems has a vested interest to keep you safely inside their walled garden. For basic photo users, the convenience and seamlessness of such products is compelling. But I've been around long enough that I don't really trust anybody or any one product entirely. Now, there are several great books out there about risk and probability. Top of mind would be Nicholas Taleb's The Black Swan. In a nutshell, a proper understanding of risk means not only identifying the likelihood of different scenarios, but also understanding whether you can tolerate the cost of certain negative tail outcomes. As traders and poker players will tell you, you win some, you lose some, but you have to stay in the game. If a drawdown wipes you out, then it's all over. And that's the whole reason the insurance industry exists. You're paying out more in premiums than your loss payout on a probability-weighted expected value basis. And meanwhile, the insurance company is making money on its portfolio of contracts because of this. But we nonetheless still do buy insurance because, if your house burns down, that just might be too big of a cost for you to swallow. Whereas for the insurance company, the risk is diversified within its vast portfolio of contracts. So you cover yourself from that catastrophic loss that you can't tolerate by buying insurance. So, it might be extremely unlikely that Apple iCloud or Google Photos loses your photo collection, but what if? What if somehow that were to happen? Can you live with that risk, however minimal it might be? Only you can answer that question. Now let me tell you the story of the inductivist turkey. It's originally told by the great philosopher Bertrand Russell, though it's often been retold. It's a simple illustration of what is known as David Hume's problem of induction. So day after day, the turkey wakes up to a life of luxury, which for an animal means that he is fed and protected from predators. No need to forage for food, he is fed all he can eat by these wonderfully generous, caring humans. So he gets used to this and thinks, well, life's pretty great. Until after 1,000 days, he wakes up to discover the real reason he was being fed and cared for all this time. So what's the moral of the story? Well, just because everything has been fine so far, does that mean things can't go wrong? What happens if one of these services fails? What happens if for some reason Apple iCloud goes down, or even just glitches and one or all of your photos are gone? What happens if your Google profile gets hacked, accidentally deleted? I mean, we don't even need to go into more doomsday scenarios like a solar storm or a nuclear war that wipes out the internet. There are plenty of more prosaic scenarios where you could lose your photo collection if you have all your eggs in one basket. Now, as with many things, there may not be a one-size-fits-all approach, and the optimal toolkit may vary for different users, depending on the volume of their assets, their level of tech savvy, and their risk tolerance, among other factors. I therefore think it makes sense to present things in terms of a framework and strategy for personal digital asset management, rather than one specific methodology and set of tools. But let me first describe and explain the specific toolkit and workflow that I use to manage my own assets, and then I will present a more generalized framework. Now, as a quick aside, it's important to include the modifier personal to distinguish the tools we're discussing here, since the term digital asset management, or DAM, typically refers to enterprise-level solutions that catalog large volumes of photography assets, as well as managing permissions and access across a large set of users. So what we're talking about here is personal digital asset management, or PDAM for short. I use Lightroom Classic as my main PDAM tool, and I have it set up to operate entirely within Dropbox for seamless redundancy, complemented with periodic external snapshot backups. I call it the belt and suspenders approach, which is a throwback to my former life as a corporate attorney specialized in syndicated bank lending. What follows here is a basic presentation of Lightroom. For more details, kindly refer to my other video called Diving Deeper on Lightroom and Setting Up Lightroom Classic to Reside Inside Dropbox. Lightroom delivers two main pillars of functionality. First, asset management, which means storing, organizing, selecting, and curating the assets. And secondly, asset manipulation. Lightroom delivers these functionalities across three separate tools or interfaces: desktop, mobile, and web. And these three tools or interfaces remain synced together via a cloud-based asset library called Lightroom Cloud. Now, the difference between Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Lightroom Classic is the following. In the case of the main Lightroom product that was formerly known as Lightroom CC, for this, the desktop client relies entirely on the cloud-based library Lightroom Cloud to store the assets. Whereas in the case of Lightroom Classic, the desktop client maintains its own asset library and catalog on the desktop system drive. Now, Lightroom isn't really just one product, but rather several tools and products, and it can get a little confusing, especially since Adobe keeps changing the branding. As I mentioned, the fully cloud-based product is now just Lightroom instead of Lightroom CC. Either way, the mobile and web clients are common to both Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. The difference resides in the desktop client. I use Lightroom Classic in my PDAM setup because I prefer the added redundancy and security of having my valuable assets stored on my desktop system instead of relying entirely on Lightroom Cloud. Lightroom costs between $10 to $20 per month, depending on the package. For more details, kindly refer to my other video called Diving Deeper on Lightroom. With Lightroom Classic Desktop, stills and video assets are imported into a catalog file, representing the entire library database of assets as well as previews. However, the asset files themselves remain stored as files within folders transparently on the desktop system drive. And this latter fact constitutes a keystone of my PDAM workflow, since it allows for the redundancy that I consider crucial. Once imported into Lightroom, the assets can then be organized into different collections, i.e. albums, for different projects, trips, themes, or any other grouping as desired, without affecting or moving the files on the desktop system drive. It doesn't matter what sort of folder structure you might use to organize the asset files on the desktop drive. I personally have top-level folders to separate personal, art, commercial, and video assets. And then within these, I tend to subdivide by year, and then by month or project. You can organize and reorganize the folder structure at any time. Any moving and shuffling of assets between folders, as well as renaming files, is done directly within the Lightroom Classic desktop client instead of Finder. The next part of the Lightroom system is Lightroom Mobile, i.e. the Lightroom app on your iPhone or other mobile device. Now, while I personally create many different types of digital assets, these days most of the photo and video assets I capture are done directly on my iPhone. Over the years, I have previously used digital SLR cameras, and obviously for professional uses, they still exist for a reason. But after being exposed to photography across many domains from fine art to fashion, my personal takeaway is that the best images are about the creative eye and Henri Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment, rather than the lens used to capture per se. And this is especially true as the quality of iPhone captures has greatly improved in recent years. I must, however, recognize a personal preference for abstract photography as well as manipulated imagery, further lessening to me the importance of capture quality. So this is all sort of subjective opinion, but to me it matters less what I use to capture an image weighed against the convenience of the iPhone, which is the camera I always have with me. With that said, following now is an outline of my asset ingestion process via Lightroom Mobile. First, the Lightroom Mobile app on my iPhone automatically imports photos and videos captured on my iPhone. Second, from Lightroom Mobile, the new assets are synced up into Lightroom Cloud. Third, from Lightroom Cloud, the new assets are synced down into my inbox folder in Lightroom Classic Desktop, thereby automatically being added to two places: my Lightroom Classic Desktop catalog and my file and folder structure on my desktop computer. Fourth, the final step is to move the new assets out of my inbox folder and distribute them into other folders on my system. As the name inbox would suggest, it's merely a temporary holding folder. Now let's talk about Lightroom Sync. With Lightroom Classic, it's important to understand that between the three tools and interfaces described, desktop, mobile, and web, there are really only two independent systems here, not three. There's Lightroom Classic Desktop and Lightroom Cloud. Let's back up for a moment. Assets ingested into Lightroom Mobile are automatically synced up to the Lightroom Cloud and then automatically synced down to the Lightroom Classic Desktop, but the reverse is not automatic. Now, you can import new folders of assets on your local desktop drive, as well as external drives, into the Lightroom Classic Desktop library, but this does not automatically sync them up into the Lightroom Cloud. Such assets can, however, be induced to sync up from Lightroom Classic Desktop to Lightroom Cloud by adding them to a collection that is toggled as Sync with Lightroom, which basically means sync up to Lightroom Cloud. Syncing up from Lightroom Desktop to Lightroom Cloud may be desired for multiple reasons. For one, collections that you may wish to share or publish as public Lightroom albums. Secondly, asset manipulation and asset selection, i.e. editing on your mobile device. I mean, you can save a lot of time by getting some editing done while your kid's at swimming lessons. And finally, having one more redundant copy of your assets in Lightroom Cloud. I therefore maintain a collection called Sync Mobile, where I can drag assets that I ingest into Lightroom Classic Desktop that I may wish to edit on mobile. But for the most part, I don't worry too much about keeping everything in Lightroom Cloud, since I use it mostly as an asset ingestion mechanism and conduit for importing newly created photo and video assets from my iPhone via Lightroom Mobile. Lightroom Classic Desktop and Lightroom Cloud must therefore be understood as two separate systems, bridged together by a sync mechanism. But alas, this sync mechanism is not completely robust, and over the years I have experienced many ebbs and flows in its stability and integrity. Several times I've faced accumulating sync errors and other sync-related issues. On the other hand, the separation of these two systems also presents the solution to such problems. Because of the third-party cloud redundancy I have in place with Dropbox, which I'm about to tell you about, in the event something ever went wrong with the Lightroom Cloud library, or if the integrity of the sync with Lightroom Classic Desktop somehow became corrupted, I only need to log into Lightroom Cloud on the web and delete the Lightroom Cloud library, which I call wipe from Lightroom Cloud, without affecting the Lightroom Classic Desktop library and catalog, which remain intact, although no longer synced. Sadly, I've had to resort to wiping Lightroom Cloud multiple times over the years, and for this reason, I tremble at the thought of trusting all my eggs in one basket. Now, some engineer from Adobe will likely chime in that the potential for sync issues is greater with two separate systems, whereas there might be less potential for issues with one system that relies entirely on Lightroom Cloud. Alas, for all its power and efficiency, the main Lightroom product cannot be considered infallible, like any software. All it takes is a left-tail incident once in a while, the occasional black swan where things go wrong, and you learn that you can't ever fully trust any one single app or platform. Now let's talk about Dropbox. Here's where the redundancy part comes in. Now, as explained, Lightroom Mobile pulls new photo and video assets from my iPhone, syncs them up to the Lightroom Cloud, and then syncs them down to the Lightroom Classic desktop on my Mac, at which point the assets are stored in folders on my desktop system drive. So there's redundancy right there to be sure, because I don't rely on Lightroom Cloud, but I have my asset files redundantly on the desktop system. But that's not all. To ensure full redundancy, in case I ever need to wipe Lightroom Cloud, I store my entire asset library, including not only all my asset files, but also the Lightroom Classic catalog machinery inside the Dropbox folder on my system drive. And this ensures continual background sync to the Dropbox cloud. Now, because I have such a large volume of assets under management, I'm on a Dropbox Advanced plan, which provides 15 terabytes of storage, which is admittedly more than I need. And if ever I needed more, you can keep upgrading up to 1,000 terabytes, for all intents and purposes, infinite storage. Now, the cost of such a Dropbox setup depends on your volume of assets, ranging from $10 a month for 2 terabytes up to $72 a month for 15 terabytes, and upwards from there for more users or storage. For more details on how I have set up Lightroom to reside inside of Dropbox, kindly refer to my other video called Diving Deeper on Lightroom and Setting Up Lightroom Classic to Reside Inside Dropbox. Now, why Dropbox? Well, I've battle-tested multiple different cloud storage systems, both via the web interface and through the native desktop app. For me, it's crucial for the cloud service to integrate directly with Finder, not only for convenience, but also to provide the continual automatic background backups of my entire digital asset library. So what did I find? Well, Dropbox, by far the fastest and most reliable. I've been using Dropbox for well over a decade and have never faced any sync issues where all the other services have failed me. Moreover, Dropbox is noticeably and substantially faster than the other services. With my fiber internet connection of 300 megabits per second, the speed bottleneck is the cloud server as opposed to my internet connection. Dropbox's faster performance is noticeable. Next, iCloud Plus. This was the biggest disappointment. Since it's an Apple product, you might expect it to perform the best at integrating with Mac OS. But it was noticeably slower than Dropbox, and even worse, when faced with large volumes, led to occasional sync errors. To me, that's just completely unacceptable. The capacity for iCloud Plus tops out at 2 terabytes, but if you combine accounts with family sharing, you can extend this up to 12 terabytes. Next, Google Drive. Well, generally I find the Google ecosystem confusing and lacking in transparency. And for full disclosure, I have not tested the native macOS Finder integration. Finally, Box. I had to use this service when working with Gap Inc.'s internal photo studio, and the performance was horrendous. I would never recommend this product. Now let's talk about the external snapshots. As my asset library has grown larger, its total volume actually exceeds the available storage capacity of my local system drive. Now, thanks to Dropbox's selective sync feature, I can hive off certain assets from my local drive, such that they remain consolidated as placeholders within the file system on my local drive inside of my Dropbox folder. But their contents are only pulled down from Dropbox Cloud when and as needed. Therefore, Dropbox Cloud in fact constitutes the only single fully comprehensive copy of my asset library, since the copy on my local drive is not complete and Lightroom Cloud is at best partial. Therefore, I have to protect against the possibility that Dropbox could be wiped out by a black swan. To borrow a term from the world of finance, we could think of this as counterparty risk. Now, cloud providers do have redundancy built into their networks such that if one of their server farms went down, your data is probably not lost. But it would be foolish to ignore the possibility that Dropbox itself could blow up entirely. I mean, it's pretty unlikely for sure, but it could happen. Moreover, there's also what you could call account risk within the counterparty risk. For example, there's an urban legend of some guy who merged his Google accounts and lost all the photos he'd been storing for years in Google Photos. I mean, it's definitely a potential risk. I feel it's probably more of a risk with the one-stop shop photo products like Google Photos that you don't realize is somehow dependent on your Google account. I mean, as opposed to data stored in Dropbox Cloud as a literal file folder structure, transparently mirroring what I have on the system drive. I feel I'm probably less likely to accidentally lose access to everything I have in Dropbox through some unintended account change, since cloud storage is the core product being offered by Dropbox, as opposed to something like Google Photos, which is just an ancillary product within a massively complex ecosystem. Then there's also the risk of malware to consider. For years, I'd been operating complacently under the false rumor that Macs were immune to the viruses that commonly plague Windows-based PCs. Until about 4 years ago, my system got infected with the SafeFinder malware, and after failed efforts to remove it, I had to resort to erasing my entire system drive and rebuilding from scratch. While Macs apparently are not susceptible to viruses per se, malware is another story. So at the end of the day, it's just semantics. Malware is a general term for malicious software, while a virus is a specific type of malware. Now, any system can be susceptible to malicious hacking, so long as the user succumbs to social engineering and clicks on a link or attachment. And for what it's worth, antivirus products are no solution. On some level, the whole antiviral industry is junkware. I'd refer you to the gold standard Apple Support Community Treatise on Mac security. It's by John Galt, and it's called Effective Defenses Against Malware and Other Threats. I'll include the link in the notes to this video. Now, furthermore, to the extent malware can infect image files, malware can be hidden inside image files through a variety of techniques. And to the extent your image files are backed up in Dropbox Cloud, then it's not inconceivable that Lightroom Classic Desktop, Lightroom Cloud, and the Dropbox Cloud backup could all be compromised simultaneously, along with any continuously connected external backups. Now, Dropbox does have version history and rewind features, so in theory, it should be possible to go back to before the point of infection and pull things back out of Dropbox. But you never know. What if Dropbox somehow fails to deliver? In case of catastrophic loss, I feel it would be prudent to have the option of resorting to a clean, uninfected external backup that had remained physically and temporally isolated since prior to the time of infection. So to protect against such risks, however unlikely, I therefore make periodic snapshot backups to external solid-state drives. When I say snapshot, I mean that I make a backup to the external drive and then I seal it and never touch it again. I'm sort of wary of regularly connected external backup systems such as Apple's Time Machine, since one of the risks you need to protect against with an external drive is that the entire system could be compromised by malware or virus. So physical and temporal separation to me seems important. Now, since the snapshots are only periodic, there would admittedly be some residual gap risk, i.e. data loss in the time interval since the last snapshot. But since I already have triple redundancy in place between Dropbox, local system drive, and Lightroom Cloud, the external drive is more of a last resort in case of a catastrophic simultaneous loss of data integrity across the other three systems. Now, the size of drive you need for this depends on your asset pipeline, but for me, 2 terabytes per year for about $150 gets the job done. For more details on my external backup workflow, kindly refer to my other video called Diving Deeper on External Snapshot Backups. So that's it. That's how I do it. But now to recap, let's zoom back out and present a more generalized framework. In the abstract, I think there are 3 pillars to it, CRR, and that means Consolidated Redundant Routine. But before we dig into what each of these means, I gotta admit, it all sounds a bit boring. And you'll probably want to forget about all of this before you finish listening to this video. I mean, if you're even still with me. So to make it a little more memorable, I've come up with a cute little mnemonic for you. Cheesy Rainbow Rave. So that's it, Consolidated Redundant Routine, i.e. CRR, or cheesy Rainbow Rave to make it a little easier to remember. Now let's dive into what each of these means. Consolidated. This means having all your assets in one single system. Not to mean that there aren't multiple copies of assets, quite to the contrary, as we saw, but that the multiple redundant copies should all be within the context of one unified and consolidated collection that might have multiple redundancies within it, as opposed to having your collection fragmented with some assets in one system and other assets in another system, because it can get messy, and over the years the risk is that you'll lose track of some of it. Redundant. As discussed, it's important to have your asset library redundantly spread across more than one system to protect against black swan events. In other words, it's the belt and suspenders approach. As the old saying goes, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And to me, this speaks to the main problem with the several one-stop shop photo collection services on the market: Google Photos, Apple Photos, Amazon Photos, and even Adobe's main Lightroom product. I mean, these are all great products with convenient features, but what if something goes wrong? Third, routine. Now this last and final element is sort of like the icing on the cake, or rather more like good dental hygiene, which is kind of the opposite of icing on the cake. But anyways, for the most part, the workflow I've described is automated. Photos and videos captured on the iPhone are automatically imported into Lightroom Mobile, and then automatically sync up into Lightroom Cloud, and then automatically download from there onto my desktop system, which resides inside of the Dropbox folder, and then they're automatically uploaded to Dropbox Cloud. But while automatic, the process still does need to be managed, or at least overseen and tended to. In order for the photos to import into Lightroom, the Lightroom mobile app does need to be open on the iPhone. For assets to then upload to Lightroom Cloud, the iPhone needs to be connected to the internet. And in order for the assets in Lightroom Cloud to then sync down into Lightroom Classic Desktop, the desktop computer does need to be turned on, and the Classic Desktop app needs to be opened for this to happen. Now, sometimes there's this one person I know who definitely isn't my wife, forgets to do some or all of these for weeks on end. And then there's a huge volume of assets being ingested. And to make matters worse, if the iPhone's memory gets full, then there's no memory available for Lightroom Mobile to import those assets, which requires iPhone system memory. And sometimes this unnamed person, who definitely isn't my wife, also forgets to turn on her desktop computer and open the desktop app, such that when she eventually does, there are thousands of assets downloading into the Lightroom Classic Desktop inbox folder, which can cause its own problems. So the whole process of asset ingestion in my PDAM workflow is automatic, but in fact, it's not fully automatic. You do need to stay on top of it. So I've chosen the moniker routine instead of automatic. So there you have it, my personal digital asset management workflow using Lightroom Classic plus Dropbox plus periodic external backups, along with a cheesy Rainbow Rave framework to achieve a belt and suspenders approach to risk management. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Apple ecosystem, and I gotta say, I would love to be able to rely solely on Apple Photos and iCloud, because that would be so very convenient. Alas, as much as I love Apple, when it comes to photos, and particularly photo management, there's a lot missing. Now, Adobe Lightroom, for its part, is an incredible and powerful tool. As I said, no other photo tool even comes close. Sadly, though, it has let me down over the years, and I don't fully trust it with my precious collection. And more generally, I feel it's unwise to trust any one single tool, hence the belt and suspenders approach that I've devised. Now, if someone didn't have it in them to implement my Lightroom Classic plus Dropbox system, my next best choice would be the fully cloud-based main Lightroom product, which would deliver most of the powerful features and functionalities of Lightroom, with, however, the important caveat that this would mean putting all your eggs in one basket, without the redundancy that I believe is crucial. Now, as always, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments.